I am Games, and this is Alt-Tabbed, a video essay series where the video doesn't matter. Feel free to tab over to another site or app while listening, unless you don't want to, in which case, enjoy this uninterrupted game footage. If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be writing a video essay on healing systems in Dark Souls, I would have laughed at you. But here, on the other side of playing Dark Souls 3, and Bloodborne, I'd argue that the game's healing systems are one of the most important aspects of these titles. Healing in Souls is integral to how you progress. By adding a degree of player choice and strategy to knowing when best to use your healing items in a specific encounter, it increases your health pool in a much more dynamic way than just merely giving you a massive health meter. While bosses might have huge bars of HP that seem stupidly stacked in comparison to you, your HP pool is just as massive. Technically, it's just that the bulk of it is sitting in a bottle in your belt, and From trusts you to make the best use of it to get your character through the game's more intense challenges. The interesting thing about the Soulsborne games is that each one subtly adjusts how healing works. Even in Dark Souls itself, Estus functions rather differently in each iteration of the series. While I've only played the Souls games I mentioned above, from what I've read up online about Soulsborne, the games I've played are actually the ones with what are commonly considered to have the best healing systems in the series, with the grass in Demon Souls and life gems in Dark Souls 2 allowing you to cheese a lot of the game if you put the time in to grind and max out your inventory on those items. Each of these 3 games have fantastic implementations on a healing system, so much so that I'm honestly tempted to dump the retro healing system in my own game that I'm working on and ape the mechanics in Souls wholesale. But because of the aforementioned tweaking done in each title, no singular healing system in Soulsborne can truly be called the definitive best. Rather, each one has its own sets of highs and lows that it brings to the table. So what is the ideal healing system in Soulsborne? Well, first, let's take a look at what each one does differently. Estus in Dark Souls 1 seems to be a direct response to the shortcomings of healing in Demon Souls. The healing mechanic in Demon Souls isn't inadequate. Having a consumable item that can be farmed is standard fare in most RPGs. The problem with grass in Demon Souls is that it hampers the design of souls at both extremes. Doing poorly and burning through your grass through repeated botched attempts at a particular challenge can leave you ill-equipped for your next run, making a difficult section of the game far more frustrating than it needs to be. But at the same time, grass can also make the game too easy, stockpiling it and maxing out your inventory, allowing you to beat basically every challenge in the game through attrition alone. This is compounded even further by the first issue leading into the next. If I'm gonna eventually run out of grass and fuck myself over, why not max out my stash so I never have to worry about it? It would be stupid not to, even if I can now potentially break the game if I allow myself the indulgence. Dark Souls said fuck that and ditched the grass, replacing it with the Estus Flask, a healing item with a small amount of limited charges, so players couldn't cheese the game by grinding 99 of them. Instead of being a consumable found in the world, Estus is automatically refilled upon death. This was a stroke of genius. Estus complements the design of Souls instead of conflicting with it like grass did. Estus became an extension of your life bar. It allowed you a predictable window of mistakes at all times, without ever allowing you to abuse the system and steamroll an otherwise balanced encounter. For the most part. For all of the elegance of Estus, though, its implementation in Dark Souls 1, in my opinion, had some wrinkles that could have been ironed out. Firstly was the upgrading of the Estus itself. While the quantity of charges your flask had were for the most part predictable, more on this in a second, the portion of health they restored was a bit more vague. This is because Estus heals a numerical value of HP, not a percentage of HP. A subtle difference, but important when Dark Souls UI doesn't display numbers. You had to kind of eyeball how much damage you could take before using an Estus made sense, which is a fine system on its own and plays into the nature of Dark Souls design, not holding the player's hand and trusting them to kind of figure shit out. It gets a bit murky though when you start upgrading your character's vitality and the strength of the flask itself. Both of these values will change the relative effectiveness of a single Estus charge. And this is where the numerical healing versus percentage healing becomes important. Because if you decide to dump tons of points into vitality and double your health pool, an Estus still heals the same X points of damage, effectively halving its potency. Which would be fine if you had numbers to reference and weren't eyeballing everything based on the HP bar in the UI, but you are. Over time, your mental references from the first few hours of play will start to become skewed as your health increases, subtly shifting when the optimal time to heal is and breaking the muscle memory you'd otherwise be building. Seemingly in order to combat this, From added Firekeeper souls. Bringing these items to a Firekeeper allows you to upgrade your Estus flask, letting each charge be more potent, with the idea to offset assumed gains in player vitality as they leveled up and bring the relative curative potency of Estus back in line. And while this is nice, it kind of only further compounds the problem, because there are only a handful of Firekeeper souls in the game, meaning that there's just enough time for a player to begin to get used to the new effectiveness of Estus, only to have it change again and needing to relearn the balance from square one. There are now 2 variables at play messing with the equation instead of just one. The point is that Estus in Dark Souls 1 is a bit unpredictable in exactly how much it will heal. Sometimes I think using Estus will bring me back to full health, only to realize that I'm still empty a notch or two. And anyone who's played these games knows that a few pixels of HP can be the difference between life and death. My second complaint with healing in DS1 is humanity. I'm just gonna say it, I personally found humanity to be pretty clunky. It serves multiple functions, but none of them seem to be all that thematically linked in the gameplay. It's like any one function of humanity was too overpowered on its own, so From used it as a currency for multiple functions in an attempt to balance its effectiveness. Humanity is used as a prerequisite for summoning, fuel for kindling bonfires, and as a second source of direct healing, not to mention a ton of other passive buffs while holding on to soft humanity. And while breaking down everything humanity does would take forever, the scope of this video only really requires 2 of its functions: kindling and healing. Kindling, in theory, is a pretty cool idea, allowing you to spend a humanity to strengthen the bonfire you're at, letting you carry more charges of Estus from that bonfire than you would normally. By default, each bonfire will start with giving you 5 Estus charges, unless that bonfire has a Firekeeper present, in which case, by default, it gives you 10. However, by spending a humanity to kindle a bonfire, it will permanently give you 10 charges no matter how many times you rest at it. And after getting the right of kindling from defeating Pinwheel, you can kindle any bonfire a second and third time with another humanity each, allowing for a maximum of 20 charges. Putting aside the question of whether 20 Estus charges breaks the balance of the game and gets us back into grass-cheesing territory, my bigger issue with kindling is that it adds, in my opinion, unnecessary fluctuation to the DS1 healing system. When you first start playing the game proper, you're brought to Firelink Shrine, a bonfire attended by a Firekeeper. Resting here, you'll be given 10 Estus and make the assumption that, oh, I get 10 Estus per attempt. Fast forward to at some point later in the game, if you're as garbage at Dark Souls 1 as I am, probably in Undead Burg, you'll realize you're no longer getting 10 Estus when respawning, but now only 5, because this bonfire isn't by a Firekeeper. Thus, the value of kindling becomes apparent. But since each bonfire needs to be kindled individually and requires a humanity, or 2 if you aren't human, you won't be able to do this every time you want to, creating an uneven launching point depending on where you are in the game. Add in the rite of kindling and warping with the Lord Vessel and this disparity can become even greater. Some fires could give you 20 Estus, while others only give you 5. It's up to you to do the legwork and grind the humanity to even everything out. Arguably the biggest misstep with humanity, though, is that it falls into the same trap that Grass did in Demon Souls, if to a lesser extent. It can be used to heal you, and since it can be found in the world, you can potentially grind it and attrition to death anything in the game. Now, granted, humanity does have a longer animation to use than Estus, making it less viable to use in the heat of battle, and that burning humanity for healing means you can't use it for other things like kindling or restoring your human form, and it seems these things were done to balance the potential cheesing humanity allows, but From undercuts these potential disincentives by allowing soft humanity to be acquired by just killing enemies, letting you use that pool for kindling while holding on to the humanity items to supplement your Estus. Actually, it's even worse than that, because by popping a humanity and using it for healing, you actually add to your soft humanity pool in addition to being fully restored in HP. So as long as you don't die, you're probably never going to lose that humanity either, so the system doesn't even work as intended. My point here is that I think the simple elegance of Estus is ironically deflated a bit by all the features built around it, creating a more convoluted system than was really required. Bloodborne does a lot to streamline the Estus system from Dark Souls 1 in a lot of ways, much like Bloodborne as a game is a streamlined version of Souls in its entirety. Blood Vials, the game's equivalent of Estus, drops all the leveling and upgrading mechanics that surrounded the Estus flask in DS1. Blood Vials cannot be leveled up because they never need to be. They always heal a consistent 40% of a player's HP, regardless of how big their actual health pool is. This is such a godsend. Gone is the ambiguity of effect that Estus and DS1 had. Blood vials always give you the same fraction of your health bar back, so the visual cues and muscle memory you start to learn from your first hours of play in Central Yharnam are never subverted. They hold true from start to finish. Likewise, you don't have to worry about spending resources to kindle bonfires to keep your carrying capacity consistent, or worry about grinding to improve your capacity over time to keep up with increasing demands from the game as you progress. You can carry 20 blood vials at once, and only 20. Unless you equip the right Carol runes, which can increase your total a little bit, but this is a buff that you control and it applies universally, much simpler to manage than running around dumping magic gasoline on bonfires all over Lordran. This entire game is balanced around this rough 20 limit of healing items, and that simplification frees you from another thing to micromanage. Bloodborne also ditches any supplementary healing items. Blood vials are the only thing that give you HP back. Instead, it adds the rallying system for supplemental healing. Each time you get hit in Bloodborne, there is a momentary window where dealing damage to another enemy can slowly restore some of the damage you took. Not only is this thematically relevant to the aggressive, bestial nature of the hunter, and subtly teaches new players to overcome the inherent fear of staring down a cosmic horror 5 times their size, but it's also a supplemental healing mechanic that cannot be cheesed. Unlike humanity, which you could collect and fall back on after blowing through your Estus, the momentary, immediate nature of rallying means it takes precedence over blood vials. If given the choice to rally to regain HP or use a blood vial, ideally you'd rally, since it uses no consumables. But it requires skill, since you're knowingly jumping back into the fray weaker than you were before with the chance of recovering HP, as opposed to backing off and using an item in comparative safety. But since rallying can only ever recover the last hit taken, and only for a few seconds, it never outright replaces blood vials. It's fucking brilliant. For all of Bloodborne's brilliance, though, there is one oversight in its system. Blood vials are a consumable item and not tied to respawns like Estus was. While your vials are refilled back to your maximum after each death, it only does so if you have enough stockpiled in the dream to cover the difference. Once you're out of stock, you're fucked. Now, granted, this is mitigated significantly due to blood vials being available to purchase from the Bath Messengers, as well as an incredibly common drop from enemies, which makes sense thematically since the healing church is everyone all but addicted to the damn stuff, but still, you run the risk of running out if you hit a particularly tough choke point, killing momentum as you're forced to go farm for more instead of being able to focus on honing your skills. This system can, funnily enough, actually punish higher skilled play. My first run through Bloodborne, my very first experience with a Soulsborne game, I got absolutely devastated in the beginning learning the ropes, spending hours grinding through first Central Yharnam and again in the Cathedral Ward. Dying as often as I did, though, I fought the same enemies over and over and over again, unwittingly farming hundreds of blood vials to the point that, throughout the rest of my playthrough, including all the DLC, I never once ran out of them. Every time I died, I always respawned with my maximum amount, to the point that, for a while, I thought that you just always spawned with 20, and that the extras I was picking up weren't actually doing anything. I wasn't aware there was even a stockpile back in the dream until way later in the game. My second playthrough, though, with a new character, I was much better at the game, and was able to breeze through Central Yharnam without dying at all, which meant my stockpile of blood vials was much lower, and that I was doing much less grinding since now my skill was carrying me where before I had to rely on brute force with leveling. This meant, though, that once I got later in the game, in this particular example I was bouncing back between the Nightmare of Mensis and Canehurst Castle, that dying a few times in a row to Martyr Logarius used up all my blood vials, and now I had to leave the area and go spend a fair bit of time longer than I would have liked stocking up on an item that, in DS1, was available right from the get-go. Dark Souls 3 brings back a bit of the complexity of DS1's healing system, which makes sense considering it's a direct sequel to Dark Souls and leans far more into the RPG underpinnings of the series, as opposed to a spiritual successor like Bloodborne, which was an action game first. Estus is back in Dark Souls 3, and just like in the original, it's a capped resource that only refills when resting at a bonfire. You can increase the amount of Estus charges you can carry at once, but the method here is far more streamlined than the system in DS1. Throughout the world you'll find an item called an Estus shard. When given to Andre, he'll reinforce your Estus flask capacity by 1. This means that your total amount of charges increases a lot slower than kindling did in DS1, but it also applies universally, since you're upgrading the flask you're holding, not the bonfire you're resting at, eliminating all the legwork and giving respawns consistency, which, in my opinion, is a much better proposition, especially considering the nature of DS3, which has warping enabled by default, and thus not only are there many more bonfires than in DS1, but you'll be jumping around the map far more frequently, which would make kindling in DS3 an even bigger challenge. Unfortunately though, Dark Souls 3 regresses back to the numerical HP healing from Dark Souls 1 instead of inheriting the percentage healing of blood vials. Like DS1, you'll find items throughout the world to boost the effectiveness of each charge of your Estus, allowing you to compensate for increases in vitality as you level up your character. Replacing humanity in Dark Souls 3 is Ember, and Ember is probably my favorite change in the game's healing system because it's only kind of a healing item, and its use is potent but limited, so it has to be used strategically. Popping an Ember restores your character's enkindled status, basically your character harnessing the power of the Lords of Cinder. Dark Souls 3 is big into fire, even more so than the first game. Anyways, in addition to allowing you to summon and invade like restoring humanity did in Dark Souls 1, being enkindled boosts your character's total health pool by 30% until death. It also fully restores your character's HP, no matter how much damage you've taken. This adds a fair bit of strategy to when best to use an Ember. Going into a difficult encounter, like a boss fight, it's tempting to pop an Ember and enkindle yourself before the fight starts, giving you that extra 30% boost right from the get-go. However, the rub is that, unlike humanity in DS1, once enkindled, you can't pop another Ember unless you die. So even if you have tons of Embers, they can't replace your Estus pool. Their effect as a healing item can only be used once per life. And if you choose to enkindle before a fight to get the HP boost right away, you're giving up a potential extra Estus, since you can't use it again in the middle of the fight. If you choose to wait to enkindle, you're squishier going in, but you can enkindle in the middle of the encounter to get through a clutch moment you might otherwise have died from. It's a simple mechanic that boils down to a single choice per fight, but it makes a big difference because of how effective that one choice can end up being. Like I said, none of these systems are inherently the best, but if I was personally going to choose the one I like the most, I'd probably give it to Bloodborne. The percentage-based healing combined with rallying makes for a predictable and mostly hands-off healing system that works, has strategy, and doesn't require micromanaging to optimize. That being said though, my ideal healing mechanic in these games would actually be a combination of all three. I think the most important part of healing in any game, but especially something like Souls where the deck is so stacked against you and requires careful consideration of action, is consistency. Healing should have very little in terms of random chance or fluctuation. The system should be introduced early on, understood, and change very little if not at all. This system is the linchpin to the player's survival and should fall into muscle memory quickly and become second nature, so that the player doesn't have to think about it in any capacity other than its utility in the current scenario they're facing. I shouldn't have to wonder how much health an Estus charge will give me back. I should know, definitively. I should be subtly taught this in the beginning of the game, and this knowledge should never falter, because if it falters, I could very well end up dead. This is where Bloodborne really got it right. No matter how much vitality I got, a blood vial always refills a predictable percentage. A blood vial used during the Orphan of Kos fight has the exact same effect as the first one I used in my entire playthrough all the way back in Central Yharnam. The percentage-based healing gives me, the player, more confidence in the tools I have available. This would also cut down on collectibles to chase around the world that are meant to compensate for complexity that is much more easily solved by just removing the offending system entirely. I like getting bigger numbers as much as the next RPG nerd, but in this case, I'd prefer a static mechanic that I can reliably predict. The entire concept of Estus, and refilling it with each respawn, or rest at a bonfire in general, is far more aligned with this consistency theme than fretting over collecting a consumable item. So I'd want to pull from Dark Souls 1 here and make sure that the healing items in Souls were a known quantity that I could reliably have with every attempt, eliminating the tedium of having to farm for a crucial item as an additional punishment for a string of poor play. Of course, the refilling in DS1 can get obtuse with the kindling mechanic, so I dumped that in favor of Dark Souls 3's more streamlined Estus shards. While Bloodborne's static total is good in my book too, I do like seeing my numbers get bigger, and rewarding me in a meaningful way for exploring the game world like increasing my Estus pool is a great incentive, and Dark Souls 3 does in a way that doesn't add the fluctuation issue present in DS1. So, there you go. My ideal Estus system, a fixed amount tied to respawns that heal a fixed percentage of HP so it scales with increases in vitality automatically, with carrying capacity able to be increased as a reward for combing over the world. You listening, FromSoft? I just gave you a golden system for Elden Ring. Feel free to DM me on Twitter to hash out the licensing terms. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I somehow just wrote a 7-page essay on a healing mechanic in a video game. I guess this is my life now. I'd be interested to hear from you if you've played Souls on what your thoughts are concerning the healing systems in this game, especially if you played Demon Souls or DS2. I can only rely on secondhand sources that said they were subpar, so if you have a different perspective on how they stack up, let me know in the comments. I'll be checking back and keeping the conversation going. In addition to working on this channel, I'm also making a game of my own, which you can check the demo out of over on Newgrounds. If you like these videos, or the game, I'd love if you could throw me $1 a month over on Patreon so I can keep the videos coming a couple times a week, and spend as much time as possible continuing to develop the game and learn more 3D animation and programming. And if you donate $5 a month, you get access to a weekly bonus podcast I make just for patrons. That's all I got for now. Until next time, remember to be the games you want to see. I'm Games, signing out.